Last fall, I learned that my fellow students and I were enrolled in the only university-level class in the nation addressing the role of prayer within the context of the American Civil Rights Movement. In fact, the Civil Rights Movement is currently being re-examined by historians to better understand the use of prayer as a form of social protest and the role that religion played in the everyday lives of Americans at the time. While contributions from prominent religious leaders such as Dr. Martin Luther King are well documented, Americans do not realize how much the success of the civil rights movement in the 1960s relied on activism from obscure people in the 1940s and 50s. Reverend Will Campbell is one of those obscure people, and his involvement in the civil rights movement resulted in continued substantiation of integration. Capitalizing on his religious position at the University of Mississippi, Campbell seized an opportunity for a national discussion on segregationist practices. Both Reverend Campbell and Dr. King were theological visionaries. They knew that constructive nonviolent tension was necessary for growth, and they demonstrated that Christians of different races shared many common values. After analyzing 16 different primary and secondary sources, I felt confident diving into this polarizing man's story. Civil rights movement scholars such as David Chappelle, Charles Payne, and Paul Harvey proved extremely helpful in understanding the gravity of the situation in Mississippi. Additionally, the writings of Reverend Campbell himself provided great insight into the motive behind his actions. Many historians have explored white religion's confrontation with the struggle for racial equality through the activities of mainline religions on a national scale. Detailed accounts of local religious communities, however, highlight a vastly different perspective, often overlooked. From a modern perspective, the sides involved are not as clearly defined as previously thought. Distinctive Christian identities frequently merged into a more general sect of Protestantism that was heavily influenced by Southern culture. In 1950s Mississippi, heightened social animosity was insupportable due to the growing concerns of racial equality, and widespread religious tension classified Southern race relations as an urgent matter. Public diatribes against religious leaders and academic institutions were paramount to the success of the early civil rights movement in Mississippi. Confrontation between white Southern Christians and national religious leaders revealed the strength of religious commitments to segregation and white supremacy, commitments that appear vague in mainline denominational histories. White people of faith fail to surface in many civil rights narratives, leading to the inaccurate assumption that white religion played an unimportant role in the civil rights movement. In 1954, a 30-year-old Reverend William Campbell became the director of religious life at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, also known as Old Miss. The Southern Baptist preacher emerged as a devout supporter and crucial figure in the American civil rights movement, and the next 2 years radicalized him and demonstrated the perils facing Southern white clergy who supported racial justice. Reverend Campbell's religious authority required him to expose the public to progressive ideas that revealed a clash between educational pursuit and efforts to preserve segregation. His sympathetic stance towards racial justice was far more tolerant than the rest of white Mississippi, and through unwavering commitment to Christian ethics and scholastic integrity, Campbell provoked a reaction from the community that furthered the cause of equal rights and justice in Mississippi. Will Campbell recognized the power of the institution and capitalized on its bureaucracy to expand the discussion of racial equality at a time when most white Southerners ignored the issue. Through religious affiliations, he forced educators to publicly defend the merits of segregation, simultaneously uncovering inconsistencies in Southern Christian values and academic integrity. Furthermore, by exerting his Christian influence on the Old Miss community, Campbell served as the catalyst that ignited a national debate surrounding academic freedom, Christian moral obligations, and the legitimacy of applied racial segregation. He perceived segregation as evil, and faithful Christian diligence demanded the pursuit of concord whenever possible. By aligning himself with an established academic institution, Campbell not only legitimized his claims, but increased his social impact beyond the pulpit. He demonstrated how Christian leaders could use their position within society to initiate positive change. He believed that the greatest danger facing Southern Christian churches was that racism had become part of the faith. At this time, Mississippi was comprehensively segregated. White churches across the South closed their doors to black worshippers and otherwise resisted the racial revolution sweeping the South. Most public institutions were completely off limits to black people, and restrictive legislation increased African American disenfranchisement. Segregationists couldn't bear the thought of shaking a black man's hand and looking him in the eye as an equal. Prejudice and racially motivated violence was deep-seated and wasn't going to miraculously change. Southern whites felt that God had created and segregated the races, and no individual, court, or Congress had the right to defy God's will by ordering integration. Segregationists often blamed crime and poverty in northern states on integration, but defense of their own southern way of life remained undeveloped. By politicizing the Christian moral obligation to integrate, Campbell differentiated himself from his colleagues and attracted unwanted attention to racial injustice in the South. He witnessed the monstrously dangerous evil that inundated his home for so long and recognized that, more than anyone else, a Southern minister held a strategic position from which to attack segregation at its root. Ministers could deploy the moral force of Christianity to break the South's grip on segregation. The trick was awakening the Christian spirit in the hearts and minds of the South's decent people. Although, in Mississippi, racial sympathizers were few and far between. From 1930 to 1950, the Magnolia State lynched 539 black people. These were public executions committed with fervor by mobs of white supremacists, mostly in rural areas. Gruesome mutilations motivated by racial prejudice were gleefully ordered by willing participants throughout Mississippi without reprimand. Mississippians fought for white supremacies in ways beyond simply preaching the biblical case for it. Mississippi State Representative Edwin White's defense of the Southern way of life echoed the sentiments felt by most white Mississippians. Representative White professed, "The South's true religion for insisting upon the continuation of segregation is to preserve the racial integrity of its people. Racial amalgamation is against the will of God." In 1954, Campbell accepted his position as the director of religious life at Ole Miss. As a university chaplain, he coordinated student activities, counseled administrative officials on religious matters, and acted as a confidant to the Ole Miss community. By the end of 1955, Campbell was embroiled in a national controversy related to religious speakers he had arranged to visit the campus. Once a year, Ole Miss designated a religious emphasis week where a select team of speakers would address public assemblies. The idea was to imbue religion into every aspect of student life and to allow for an academic discussion of the topic. After the 1955 Religious Emphasis Week, Campbell decided that the next one should deal with the application of Christian principles to the Southern race relations. Everyone at the university, however, understood that race was not to be discussed. Reverend Campbell recognized that an open debate on racial matters would be too provocative, but wanted the speakers to be sympathetic to racial justice. He felt that if racial equality could not be discussed in the classroom, it would be proclaimed from the podium of the religious forum. Reverend Alvin Kershaw, a minister and professor from Ohio, was invited to attend the 1956 Religious Emphasis Week, and Campbell knew that Kershaw was active in civil rights causes and supported the NAACP, even serving as a vice president of his local chapter. White Mississippians were livid that a supporter of the vehemently hated NAACP was coming to speak on campus. Campbell was flouting the segregationist status quo, and Chancellor J.D. Williams received countless letters of protest regarding Kershaw's visit. State Representative James A. Morrow led the protest of Kershaw's scheduled appearance. He was quoted as saying, "I do and will continue to believe in segregation, no matter what my preacher or my religion may say to the contrary, and I know every red-blooded Mississippian feels the same." Soon, the university found itself situated squarely in the middle of a national debate, and Chancellor Williams warned the Institute of Higher Learning Board of Trustees that disallowing Kershaw's visit suggested a new policy of barring anyone who opposed racial segregation. Pitted against the segregationists, Campbell devised a three-part plan to overcome the opposition he faced. First, he refused to be responsible for the cancellation of Kershaw's visit. Second, he wanted Kershaw to persevere and not to voluntarily withdraw from the Religious Emphasis Week. Third, He wanted all other invitees to remain committed to the Religious Emphasis Week, but if Kershaw was forced out of the program, to cancel their appearances as well. Campbell saw the monstrously evil power of the legislatures led by the White Citizens Council, and he told Kershaw that the Citizens Council was threatening to close the university if he came. The IHL Board of Trustees passed a resolution to end their involvement, deciding to leave the Kershaw invitation up to the Ole Miss administration. The decision was now left to Chancellor Williams, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with the entire situation. Like the rest of Mississippi, he wished the subject had never come up. White moderates felt that segregation was what it was, and not much could be done to change things. And any attempt to do so would be received with great disapproval. Williams wanted to avoid a spark to ignite an explosive situation. What he failed to recognize was that he was already engulfed in flames. Protective of his institution and mindful of financial repercussions, Chancellor Williams canceled Reverend Kershaw's visit, and to the displeasure of the students and faculty. He said that Kershaw's visit would provoke additional controversy inconsistent with the Religious Emphasis Week. Williams wanted to avoid negative publicity, and the Kershaw controversy would damage Ole Miss's prestige. Ironically, by not allowing Kershaw to attend, Williams had done exactly what he was hoping not to do. The decision to cancel Kershaw's visit attracted the attention of powerful religious influences, inspiring them to participate in a discussion they had been avoiding for so long. The controversy led to dramatic ramifications and sparked a fire in the belly of Christian moderates who supported freedom of speech and religion. Methodist preacher Reverend Meadows expressed fears for the possibility of censorship on religious services. He thought that disallowing Kershaw's visit violated basic freedoms He thought that disallowing Kershaw's visit violated basic freedoms of thought and religion and directly threatened those charged with the trusteeship of the American pulpit. He believed that it was the Christian and civic duty to defend the right of every minister to interpret his faith in whatever light he sees it, and that encroachment by the university must not be tolerated. The Episcopal Bishop of Mississippi found it hard to exaggerate the possible harm that would come to Mississippi through an unwise decision. He noted that a free and open debate was required for arriving at the truth. The decision led to the resignation of sociology professor Morton King, who had worked at Ole Miss since 1939. He cited the chancellor's cancellation of Kershaw's visit as the immediate and precipitating reason for his resignation, along with grievances of defense of free speech, thought, and inquiry. Professor King argued that academic freedom was not involved in Kershaw's case, stating that the administration and board are no longer able to defend here or on any other campus in the state the freedom of thought, inquiry, and speech, which are required for higher education to flourish. Throughout the state of Mississippi, white, educated individuals were taking a stand. Academic freedom clashed directly with the wishes of segregationist legislators who controlled the university. Canceling Kershaw's visit was seen as censorship, but powerful forces in the state threatened retaliation and compelled the university officials to abide. Reverend Campbell was not the only one on campus who wanted Kershaw's visit approved. A survey by the Mississippian showed that nearly 3/4 of students felt that he should be allowed to speak, stating that they could form their own opinions. Campbell's actions forced the powers to admit publicly that they were the powers and those at the university were the pawns. His commitment to Christian brotherhood exposed the paradox of Christian defense of segregation while gathering public support for integration in a dangerous climate. He dramatized the segregation issue so that it could no longer be ignored. Simply the words of a progressive minister was insufficient for the task at hand, which required a religious revolution rather than mild reform. Campbell wanted to magnify the whole conflict by suspending the entire program, but compromised and found a solution. He knew that he would need some dramatic event to get the sympathy of white folks. In lieu of public lectures, Campbell sat at the Fulton Chapel in silent meditation, attempting to appeal to a higher power. He extended a sincere invitation to all members of the community. He said, "This call to prayer is not a display of superficial piety, but it is rather the recognition that we have gone as far as we can go, and perhaps it is on such an admission that God chooses to enter human history." Hundreds of people joined Campbell in silent protest. The auditorium stage was completely cleared except for a drawn curtain and 2 empty chairs. Worshippers did not receive spoken sermon from a biased minister, nor did the congregants recite hymns in unison. The prayer event was designed to be an honest Christian evaluation of individual convictions. His modified religious emphasis week allowed the audience to internally contemplate individual sentiments, which led to the revelation that those positions are not benign. Religious convictions possess the power of public influence, and Christian scriptures dictated that power must be exercised respectfully. Campbell wanted people to be aware of the consequences of their actions without casting judgment. Although he disagreed with segregation, he understood the value of personal transitions and encouraged others to grow alongside with him. Subsequent nonviolent public prayer demonstrations helped bring a much-needed attention to the domestic terrorism that was ongoing since slavery. The importance of those individual convictions, however, were diminished by the sheer fact that whites began questioning what they had never questioned before, and they were searching their souls for answers. For years, churches and other institutions shied away from their moral obligations and social responsibilities. Campbell used his position within the church to attack Christianity for failing to take a bold stance against racism and segregation. As he saw it, the overwhelming majority of white churches had shunned their responsibility and made a mockery of the gospel by condoning racism in the church and society. As a preacher, Campbell mastered the art of public praying. He knew that members of religious communities possessed the unique ability to imagine a seemingly impossible reality. Campbell recognized that if someone can imagine unity in a religious arena, he or she could realize true Christian brotherhood in Mississippi. Through his commitment to Christianity, Campbell guided others to the light of God by creating an environment that fostered personal epiphany. He knew that permanent change only occurred when an individual is overwhelmed by the intrinsic desire to do so. If white people simply thought about segregation in the South, they would inevitably further discuss it. Campbell's higher understanding of religion and education gave him tremendous influence over white Protestants, and his public display of atonement transitioned from conversant prayer, or a private conversation with the divine, into a liturgical realm of performative prayer. Performative prayer refers to a public performance or prayer that has religious form, although the very act of praying has more significance than the prayer itself. Campbell had the privilege of being an insider. He knew what it was like to be white, but through his own empathetic concern had discovered what it meant to be black. Leading by example, Campbell consciously went against the grain to the point of what some would call deception for the greater good. He regarded his opponents as dangerous and evil, which perhaps explains his voracious commitment to the cause. He knew that the only way to make a difference was to get some exposure to the problem, and when the spotlight shines bright on a subject, there is little else to do but discuss it. The cracked ice on the frozen pond of segregation began to break up, and the wildfire that followed Will Campbell melted the thick ice forever. He breathed life into the civil rights movement as God breathed life into man. Through performative meditation, a new generation of Southern white Christians publicly demonstrated solidarity with the civil rights movement and denounced the practice of segregation. In doing so, those who participated confirmed their own individual beliefs and subsequently were forced to defend them when challenged. This was the beginning of a movement from within Mississippi of white moderates disassociating themselves with white supremacists. Massive generational discontent and increased condemnation of segregation from other Southerners proved to be a contributing factor to the death of Jim Crow South.